One of the things that I wanted to cover was this video from Demon Mama of her reacting to a video by BadMouse on settler colonialism. And I wanted to cover it, honestly, for like a year now, but I keep forgetting. I keep forgetting. It was like a year ago and I was like, oh, I need to respond to this on stream. And I just keep forgetting because I think it's just a fantastic example of something that I'm just going to invent right now called settler fragility. Like where people living on the settler side of a settler colonial society are confronted with the very basics of settler colonialism for the first time, and they just erupt like Roblox oof sound. That is their reaction to it. They just like immediately throw out whatever the first dumb shit that comes to mind is to attack the person bringing this to them. And there's also the extra element in that she was responding to BadMouse, and BadMouse basically made a video that was it was a basic explanation of settler colonialism, but it was framed as like a response to Vosh or a critique of Vosh. And that was his biggest mistake, because it doesn't matter what you say at that point. It doesn't matter how right you are. You're going to get attacked by these morons because they're not allowed to disagree with Vosh. They're not allowed to critique Vosh, especially not in something as profound as the very origins of the societies that they live in. And the thumbnail here is so fucking funny, as if, for one, she depicts herself as like black, by the way. That's fucking bizarre. What the fuck is that? Why does your idiotic anime OC have dark skin? You're white. You're pasty fucking white. And for two, why is he sweating? You'll see what I mean. The only thing that happened in this video is that she lost the debate to an inanimate video and embarrassed herself hilariously. But it's also indicative of a much broader thing, which is like that these people, these settlers, these pro-settler colonialism people get so fucking angry at the very existence of their societies, basically. Anyone talking about the origins, the basic origins of their societies, the basic facts about what they are and how they function. That makes them so fucking pissed. And just add in the fact that it was a response to their favorite pedophile streamer, and it just gets even worse.
I have to say that even I was under the impression, despite everything I've seen of him, that Vosh, or Ian, might have at least understood some general basics about racism. After piling through 3 hours of his debate with Professor Flowers,
white rights, of course,
that turned out to be wrong.
I mean, okay, an interesting start. Very interesting start. For sure. But let's find out. Let's give it a chance.
I'll just say this here. Demon Mama is the stupidest person I've ever seen. Like, every single thing I've ever seen her feature in, she's the epitome. Like, this is already what streamers do. Like, they just, react with whatever comes to mind about things that they dislike. It's like, someone says something you dislike, you just say, I don't like this. This is bad. Oh, scream like a gorilla. That's what they do. That's the general streamer thing. And, it works most of the time, because most of the time they're reacting to like fucking Republicans and conservatives and shit. And then it comes to them trying to employ that same sort of, the same sort of essence of their being against someone giving a very simple, basic, and factually correct explanation of settler colonialism. All that they do is just yell, oh my God, I can't fucking believe it. Wow. How could he possibly say that? While someone is saying things that are objectively fucking correct in every way, shape, and form, and which they should fucking agree with because they identify as fucking anarchists. It's hilarious. So it's not just that, they're delving into concepts they've never heard of before. It's that they would oppose these ideas anyway because of their position in society that they are very invested in defending. Demon Mama is a settler, and the settler colonial society benefits her greatly, and any notion that, she might be an occupier living on stolen land is obviously going to be incredibly confronting for her. It's going to be something that she's going to want to oppose. You think she cares about Indigenous people? You think she's ever spoken to an Indigenous person in her life? No, obviously not. What she cares about is maintaining her position in society while putting on this sort of edgy lifestyle anarchist charade where she's really cool and awesome and 100% real, true anarchist, while also just happening to support the US state in every single little thing that it does, and to get incredibly angry at someone explaining the very basics of her country's formation, history, and social relations to her, while just sort of using like the anarchist ideology as like window dressing because she thinks it's cool. It's obviously a lot cooler and hipper to call yourself an anarchist and be like, oh, I'm so rebellious and shit. And it is just admit what your actual political positions are, which is liberalism.
Give it a chance. Let's find out what we can find out, okay?
How can a person be an oppressor because of their race? Did all the millions of white people in South Africa like individually oppress all the black people there? And I can tell you from my experiences online, there are a lot of black people who are pretty goddamn racist. I think it's kind of silly to pretend that there aren't black people who just are kind of shitty to
I
white
want to
people
see, like, I don't remember how she defends this, but I need to see it if she even tries.
in a way
Okay, so far, let's
that doesn't have a sort of institutional bias behind it. There is nothing about being white that inherently makes you more racist. Over here in America, there are a lot of black people that are racist against white people. It's not like one tribe ruled America. The tribes that ruled the Americas before we came here
there's a bunch of
conquered
different
other
tribes.
tribes before.
That's literal, by the way, that is the most generic right-wing conservative argument ever. It's a complete misunderstanding of what colonialism is, what settler colonialism is, and it essentially relies on, well, what we did to them is justified because they had fought each other beforehand too. It's literally a stone toss comic, by the way. Literally. He's literally using a stone toss comic argument. This is it. Imagine defending that.
People.
So does America belong to the tribe that owned it last, or the first tribes that we can ever anthropologically?
Tribes, anthropologically. This is the biggest like pseudo-intellectualism you'll ever see in your life. Someone intentionally doing everything they possibly can to just sort of like muddy the waters of what settler colonialism is, how it's totally different to everything that happened beforehand, and being like, well, what we did might be bad, but obviously we shouldn't do anything to remedy it or change it, because we have this mythology we've created where the people who we did this to were just as bad as we were.
Determine control of the territory.
Lua has already done her own response. I'm not going to pretend that I know everything or speak for her, but I had some time on my hands, and this debate really annoyed me. So I just wanted to try and talk about a few things. What can I say? I'm an unpredictable man. The reaction that Ian and his fans exhibited when faced with the general assertion that...
Okay, I find this very weird. First of all, to like try to use people's like first names if you don't know them, I find that really awkward. Like,
I like how she couldn't actually take exception to the substance of anything. So she doesn't like the fact that he calls Vosh by his actual name instead of the like blackface self-insert character that he created to name himself after.
that is not a meaningful critique of the message of this so far.
Oh my
I just find that very awkward. I would never want somebody to ever use what they thought my IRL name was in a video like that, unless they were my friend.
Okay,
my
Sharon.
personal friend. That's very strange to me.
Okay, Sharon.
And also, I don't think that either of those three quotes that were played did a very good job of backing up the idea that Vosh does not understand racism.
They 100% speak for themselves. Like saying, there's so many black people who are racist against white people. That is like the epitome of showing that you don't understand what racism is. Bringing up a literal stone toss argument. I've never seen a better misunderstanding of what racism actually is, which is a system created by white people for the interests of white people to justify domination over other people who they consider to be non-white. That's what racism is. That's what it always has been. So to be like, there's so many black people who are racist against white people easily demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of what racism actually is.
The idea, like we talked about this during our analysis of the Professor Flowers debate, which is
Your analysis of the Professor Flowers debate.
That, like, yes, people who are themselves marginalized can indeed be racist.
Not against white people. Unless you do not know what racism actually is, you don't know what racism was invented to be, what it continues to be utilized for, which is white supremacy. Certainly not black supremacy. Now, black people and other so-called non-white people can certainly be racist against each other, because thanks to this whole system of racism invented by white people in order to justify and maintain their own material supremacy of other people who they consider to be non-white, this system creates a lot of incentive for that. It creates a lot of reason for fighting between people who aren't considered privileged enough to be at the top of the totem pole. You can kind of understand that to be racist, but she's talking about anti-white racism being exhibited by black people, the people who have always historically been placed at the very bottom of this system by white people. Still are today, in fact. Like, anyone who would ever try to justify someone who just outright said, so many black people are incredibly fucking racist against white people, rather than actually, thinking about what they consider to be racism against white people, thinking about why it exists, the systems that were set up that have destroyed essentially the existence of black people all across the world, really, like deprive them of the very basics of who they were, or at the very least tried very hard. Obviously they failed in many cases in Africa, but in When we're talking about North America, for example, people were literally kidnapped from across the world and deprived of everything that made them who they were, to the point that, you know, they had to sort of create a new identity that was a bit of an amalgamation between what little was left of what they had before and just their struggle against this racial oppression levied upon them. Do you think you can take someone like that being like, fuck you, cracker, and try to be like, that's the same thing as a white person calling them the N-word? It's a part of the same system as that. Like, is the black person trying to like justify their material dominance over the white person in saying that? Is it a part of this system of dominance created by them, for them, in order to dominate these other people on little more than the color of their skin? Or is it maybe completely different and worthy of being analyzed using a totally different framework, a totally different understanding? Obviously it's the latter, and to defend someone saying something that fucking stupid when they're supposed to be a supposed left-wing commentator is fucking stupid as hell. Vosh does this all the time. Vosh doesn't analyze these things. He just like points at them and says, haha, look, black people can be racist too. I guarantee I'm going to go to his channel right now. He's going to have a video that doesn't analyze racism in like the first couple of pages, and rather just points at black people being like, look, black people, here it is, here it is, here it is. Black Nazis and the regular Nazis are merging. So there's the black Nazis, right? And they're the same as the white Nazis. There's no difference here at all. There's no difference in their origins, no difference in their substance, no difference in their function. Rather, for people like Vosh, who are very invested in trying to spread this idea of black anti-white racism, it's all the exact same. It doesn't come from different places. It's not essentially black people just trying to co-opt white supremacy from white people and place themselves at the top of this system that white people created at the expense of black people. No, what it is just the exact same thing. All racism, or what these people think is racism, it's all the same to them. Yeah, I mean, Vosh constantly makes videos about how racist black people are and how, oh my god, black people can be racist too. And obviously Demon Mom is going to agree with that, because her entire thing is to like chug Vosh's turds. Like, she's like 20 fucking people down in the human centipede of clout. Vosh's turds get to her and she needs to like swallow them whole, because that's the only way that she gets viewers.
Isn't my first name relatively known? Yeah, it kind of is. Some people know it. But still, I don't care. I don't want somebody to use my fucking government name. That's weird, okay?
Government name, okay, Sharon.
The thing is that, like, I don't think either of those three were very good examples of it. So, yes, some people, they were pretty clearly clipped out of the context of the conversation, where he was pushing back against PF's assertion that colonialism equals white people. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't only equal white people. But yes, whiteness and colonialism and racism are greatly tied together. And I think that there are ways in which you can come to the conclusion that, like, it's a lot harder or a lot different for somebody who is in a marginalized racial group to engage in racism, but we know that this happens. We know that there's racism that happens.
You see, she doesn't really have a systemic understanding of what racism is, despite sort of putting on the facade that she does. It's just that, you know, they can engage in racism. It does happen. It's less common and it might be slightly different, but it's still racism. It's still the exact same thing. It's not at all. It's really not. One of these, you know, racism is specifically a system of domination. It's a system of domination created by white people for white people. So, you know, just being mean to a white person, be like, boo boo, I don't want to talk to you because you're white, or some shit like that. It can be a bit, as the kids these days would say, cringe or something, but it's certainly not even remotely a part of the same system of racism.
Between other marginalized racial groups. Like, it's just something that happens. So Zanzi is going to talk to PF about how colonialism manifested in Ireland, a situation where everyone's white, so you can take whiteness out of the equation. Well, you actually can't take whiteness out of the equation entirely, but that will be an interesting conversation, because
Okay, these videos need editing.
And he didn't want that to be dictated to me of...
Even if you consider the definition of racism to be, prejudice plus power, because I think that...
the definition of racism is a million times more complicated than any of these people are really willing to go into. You can't define a concept like that with two fucking words like that, regardless of how much you want to, or even if you're just playing lip service to it. That's not what it is. God, I fucking hate how, like, these people are just such a low level of understanding of any of the things they talk about.
By a matter of comparison, that Dave Chappelle, for example, is in a position of power compared to most of the people that he was venting his prejudice against. So I think that these three quotes that were...
I mean, Dave Chappelle wasn't engaging in racism. He was engaging in transphobia or homophobia. This is not the same thing.
given aren't a very good starting point for this conversation. But let's see where it goes.
It's not a good starting point. I mean, Vosh outright said, there's so many fucking black people racist against white people. Unbelievable.
That it's not your right to dictate the terms of decolonization to the colonized is actually not too unfamiliar to me, because it reminds me of, well, me. When I was a young leftist, I felt particularly uncomfortable by this man. Because if you know, Malcolm X didn't take his fools gladly. He didn't give a shit and he took no prisoners, because fundamentally, he wanted autonomy for his own people, and he didn't want that to be dictated by whites. His manner and content of speaking always made me, as a white dude, feel a bit, I don't know, he says such hostile stuff, he doesn't care about white people, this doesn't work, we gotta work together. Yet, as time went on, I started connecting some of the stuff that he said to the stuff that I see in real life. And I started to understand a little bit better the mindset of minorities. I started listening to more of his work and other people's, like Franz.
Okay, but keep in mind that this is something that also happened in one of the other videos that was conveniently by a white person critiquing another white person, which is this idea that you understand the mentality of minorities. Minorities aren't a monolith. They're not a monolith. This cannot be avoided.
The fuck are you talking about, you dumb motherfucker? It doesn't matter. That's totally irrelevant to any of this. He's talking about these specific people. He's saying that he can understand how they came to the conclusions that they did because of the situations that they were put in by white people like you. 50 years ago, you would have been a fucking segregationist. Jesus.
It's not just a quippy statement. That is a simple truth.
This is how they operate, basically. Like, yeah, we can just discount what these people said in their very thorough analysis of the situations that they and their people were in, because I'm sort of implying that there are other people from the same groups that they're in who agree with what I think. I mean, for one, there are collaborators in, you can find a collaborator from every group. Frantz Fanon, right? He wrote extensively about how colonialism engenders this sort of class of collaborators, multiple classes of collaborators, right? Like the outright, really open and obvious ones, and then the ones who are like just sort of like adopt the ideology of the colonizer, being like more liberal, sort of like, we want to become free, but not so much to really do things in our own way, but more to like become like a shallow husk trying to imitate the systems of the colonizer. So Fanon was very big on like a very autonomous form of national colonial liberation, where like colonized people would actually form their own societies post-colonialism, rather than just becoming so now we are our own independent state, but we're going to basically copy France or whatever. And guess what actually happened? They all ended up copying their colonizers. They ended up replicating their systems. They ended up becoming like a shallow copy of the colonizer, exactly as what he denounced would happen and warned about, and since then have been very easily dominated by the so-called former colonial powers. And yeah, that's why the name of the book is Black Skin, White Mask. Like, just because like someone's providing like a list of like very in-your-face anti-colonial intellectuals who didn't take prisoners, who didn't coddle white people, and her reaction seems to be to just be like, actually, but there are some minorities who agree with me. They're not a monolith. It's like just a generic sort of social justice argument where you don't need to actually engage with what's being said at all. Even with the arguments of the figures who are being brought up, you just can discount them by sort of slightly implying that there might be some people in the same group as them, in the same situation as them, who agree with you more due to the ideology that has been imposed upon them through centuries of white colonialism. And yeah, no fucking doubt. Just like how, for example, I can find among the working class lots of fascists, even though they are a part of the working class, even though the interests of the working class might be to overthrow capitalism, to form anarchism or communism or socialism or whatever the fuck your pet left ideology may be. Yet, I don't see you making these sorts of social justice warrior arguments in those cases where you're like, well, the working class isn't a monolith. Some of them want fascism. Some of them want liberalism. Maybe some of them want socialism. You can't try to imply that it might be in their interest to follow the prescriptions of these specific guys when they're not a monolith. They all think very differently. They all have very different beliefs. Well, no fucking shit. No fucking shit. After 400 fucking years of brutal fucking colonialism, the people who were its most, the most victimized of its victims might have internalized a lot of the narratives of the colonizer, might have ended up believing in a lot of the propaganda that the colonizer has imposed upon them. just like those working class people do for anti-working class propaganda that goes against their interests. What you're arguing here is just an argument from identity, except from not even from an identity that you have. It's fucking nothing.
I don't know. This feels like a self-report in a certain way, but say map perfectly one-to-one onto racial stuff. It's a simple truth. There are great disagreements look at the disagreements that have occurred not even talking about racial minorities, between me and other trans people who have very, very different worldviews than me. This is something that you can't just brush.
This is totally irrelevant to, as I just went over. Her way to discredit this argument isn't to actually deal with it, nor the arguments that the people who BadMouse is talking about made, nor to actually deal with the situations that they came from and how they are incredibly meaningfully different from anything that any white people would experience.
Off. Yes, and you can't.
It's just meaningless, this response. This is how they operate, basically. They never actually respond directly to what's being said nor implied.
Not make a monolith out of a group to conveniently fit your political argument. I think
that's literally what she's trying to do here. She's trying to imply that, there's members of this group who agree with her, so she doesn't actually need to deal with what's being stated here. She just needs to slightly imply, well, there's other black people who would agree more with what I believe in, which is, liberal, hold hands, kumbaya, black people are so racist against white people, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, no fucking doubt there is. You're still not adequately dealing with what's being said at all.
I think you could make the argument, that that perhaps someone wasn't doing a very good job understanding diverse perspectives, or that they weren't understanding a particular perspective.
You don't need to understand diverse perspectives. The idea that you need to understand diverse perspectives is specifically what is used by conservatives to legitimize their idiotic ideas of universal free speech, of absolutist free speech. It's the same fucking argument. I don't give a shit about someone's perspective because of who they are, okay? Or because of their lived experience or whatever. I give a shit about their perspective based on the actual quality of that perspective, the quality of the arguments that they make. This is liberalism par excellence. We need to respect what people say, essentially purely because of the color of their skin. Whereas she's using that argument here to explicitly denounce black people, to denounce the perspective of very well-learned black people whose basically entire life was dedicated to thinking about the problems of black people under colonialism, under systems of racial dominance, and trying to remedy them. And she's discounting that with being like, well, there might be some other black people who agree more with me, who don't make me as uncomfortable as these black people do. So you're not allowed to talk about these black people. You're not allowed to talk about the, objectively fantastic quality of arguments that they made, given the context of their lives, of the situations that people were in, of the situations that they were dealing with, in the things that they said and wrote.
Perspective, but I don't think that you can just make a blanket statement like I didn't understand the singular perspective of X marginalized group. I think that's very silly. Yeah, Blair White is a great example with regard to trans stuff, which doesn't map perfectly one-to-one onto racial stuff, but there are comparisons.
Yeah, okay. Malcolm X is Blair White. Frantz Fanon is Blair White.
But let's continue.
Fanon.
Didn't somebody come into chat during the analysis comparing Vosh and Flowers to MLK and Malcolm X? Yes, and I laughed about it because that's a very silly thing to say.
James Baldwin. And eventually my opinion on Malcolm X turned from a cowering to one of, is what it is, right on.
Isn't that a bit of a I don't know. This feels like a self-report in a certain way. Doesn't it? A little bit? I don't know.
Oh my God. Isn't it kind of weird? Like how these people they don't ever engage with the things they're watching. As I said at the beginning, they just sort of express distaste and try to derail what's even being talked about. There's never a direct refutation of what's actually being said. It's kind of a self-report. Why? What the fuck are you even talking about? Someone said, this guy used to make me uncomfortable with his talk on racial issues, and then I kind of came to understand him once I thought about it more. You should be aiming to do the same fucking thing, because you clearly don't get any of this. Jesus.
Because I understood, I guess, my place in the world. I understood, I've got it pretty well off, to be honest. And I got that when it comes to your sense of self, all of the pedantic consistencies never really matter much in the long term. What you want first and foremost is to exist as a human being. I think people got this same anxious, almost offended feeling when No Name said that she didn't want Whitey following her on Twitter anymore.
Okay, so that's actually not what No Name really said, honestly. Which, again, this feels very weird to me to have a white guy summarize No Name's comment incorrectly. Because
it's like, oh my God, I can't believe a white guy is saying this. Someone who is explicitly here to argue against the liberation of Indigenous people and black people, particularly in the US, but also in Canada, here to be like, it's so fucking unbelievable. This person would dare to summon the argument of a black person. That's so fucking racist. There's zero like, I don't even have anything to respond to because she doesn't want to make an argument with any sort of substance.
No Name didn't say that she didn't want Whitey to follow her on Twitter. In fact, the tweet is right here. And I actually disagree with Vosh's response to No Name's tweet. I actually think No Name's tweet is perfectly fine. And I don't really think there's anything wrong with it. And I feel like Vosh's response to it was way overblown personally. But this is fucking cringe.
You're not allowed to disagree with Vosh. You're going to get in trouble for that one. Oh, well, she didn't. She's too much of an integral part of the centipede for that.
I find that very cringe.
This is cringe? I find that very cringe. That's your critique? Are you a 14-year-old on TikTok? What the fuck? Can you please speak like a normal person?
To take a tweet that's perfectly good in what it is here and then boil it down to don't follow me, Whitey.
I mean, it's perfectly fine as a summary, because even if it was, don't follow me, Whitey, that would be totally fine. Do you think people of color, indigenous people, black people, whatever, need more white people coming into their spaces and just spouting idiotic faux messages of unity without actually doing anything to further them, without actually really getting to the crux of the issue, as you are failing to do massively here? Seeing someone say, oh, black people are so fucking racist against white people all the time, as Vosh did in the beginning, and not saying that immediately, I mean like, oh yeah, I don't agree with that. That's just fucking stupid. But instead attacking the person who was using that as an example of someone not understanding racism or colonialism.
That feels really fucking weird to me.
No Name, you gotta work together, No Name.
Yeah, exactly. Literally every single reply here is, how can you divide us? How can you divide us? I mean, the real answer to that should be, why did you divide yourselves from them? Why did white people create the system of racism to divide themselves from black people and put themselves on the top of a very advantageous system they still benefit from greatly today, that's still very much in place today? That's a much better question than, why don't you want to take more shit from ignorant fucking white people who try to explain shit to you all the fucking time? Which I think is a question with a pretty obvious, self-evident answer.
Woke segregation. Fred Hampton. Yes, because acclaimed black communist rapper No Name has totally never heard of Fred Hampton. Okay. Take a hint.
I don't know what any of this has to do with anything, honestly.
It is this very milquetoast, baby's first political education mindset that appears to be very common these days, especially amongst white American lefties, but is also across the
God, I hate the word lefties. Anyone who self-identifies as the lefties is a lefty. Absolutely just self-reporting. Lefty is just a moniker that you apply to yourself when you're a Democratic Party aligned liberal. Maybe Bernie Sanders tier at most, who is completely aligned with the continuation of white supremacy, basically with the new white supremacy. The new white supremacy is this idea, implied or outright stated, that so-called liberal Western civilization is superior, but it's not an innate racial or ethnic superiority. Other people can also take on superior Western liberalism, okay? That's the new white supremacy. So the new white supremacy is not, we are better than you, we are innately superior to you, and you can never become like us. It's, we are superior to you, but it's not innate, and you can become like us. Take our hand, and us white people will show you the way. That's the new white supremacy. And people like Vosh,
communism is based,
etc. Sharon, Ian and Sharon, they are very good examples of this.
As well, who seem to think that it can all just be solved by what I can only describe as vague gesturing. Let's all work together.
A really good example of what I was just talking about, by the way, was during the 2018 World Cup, people were saying like a lot of the French players come from French African colonies. They're like first-gen or second-gen immigrants from their former colonies. People were saying the French team is basically an African team. Most of the players on it are African. French football would fucking suck without them having exploited Africa. And all these French racists came to be like, oh my God, you're by saying that, you're denying the Frenchness of these people. You're denying that they have integrated into the superior French Western society. You're the real racist. And I saw that, and I was like, wow, these people are just really saying it out loud. And that's a great fucking example of the new white supremacy, where nowadays it's become racist to even acknowledge the fact, the history and simple facts about ongoing Western colonialism, because in doing so, you're apparently denying these people's right to a supposedly superior identity, in this case French, which you're not doing, by the way, because obviously acknowledging the fact that they were relatively new immigrants from French African colonies does not deny that they are French. So being French is a bad thing, so I'm not exactly sure why denying them being French would be a bad thing, but that's how white supremacy, Western supremacy works.
And that's not how it works. You can't just claim, yeah, integration, and then by some magic formula, we all just get along. I remember a certain black communist state his absolute disdain for when white pinkos come into black spaces during and after actions and hand out flyers for their org under the banner of, yeah, let's unite, but then are never ever seen again. Do you understand that that doesn't really seem to fit, right? There's something very...
Something out of static says, yeah, like Vosh may have done it too briskly, but he was trying to make a very valid point about people like PF's rhetoric. Yeah, well, that was before the PF chapter, though, right? Wasn't the no-name thing before the PF chapter? And also, I think that his critique was
That's great that, like, Vosh has been on, like, this fucking... Basically, like, oh, the blacks are racist kicker for, like, years now. That this even goes back, like, before he got confronted by Professor Flowers. That's incredible.
Poorly aimed. No names take, in my opinion, is perfectly legitimate. There is an attempt sometimes for white leftists to enter active organizational spaces that have already come together. There have already been people doing things, and then be like, no, you're doing it wrong. I think that's a very real thing. Oh, you're talking, yeah, in the PF convo, but I already said my opinions about the PF convo. I think that Vosh made some missteps, but that ultimately PF was not prepared to actually have the conversation that she came into, and she...
Now we're getting into the real settler colonialism advocacy. I can't wait.
Came in guns blazing in a way that I think most people will find imparsible. So
most people. Now, if you want to talk about a self-report, that's a self-report. Most people, white people, that's what she meant to say. I think white people will find it impossible. No fucking shit. White people don't like to be confronted by their victims and told the truth about the societies that they live in. We know that. You should know that. You're supposed to be an anarchist. She's the like bathtub pharmacy anarchist, by the way. Let's see if I can find her incredible tweets. Her brand of anarchism is to be like, we don't need pharmacists, we don't need doctors. I'll make medicine in my bathtub and hand it out to my community. We don't need supply chains. I just want to blow shit up. Well, there is like a quote of what she tweeted, but it was turned into a Breaking Bad meme. Just get some lab equipment, befriend a chemist, and start making ADHD medication yourself. Talk to rural doctors and healers. Healers. A healer is just a euphemism for someone who should not be practicing medicine, who are already doing this out of necessity. Holy shit, it's a verbatim quote. It's not actually misrepresenting her. And it wasn't her, sorry, I misremembered. It was her friend, Exilia X. How do you manage large supply chains without bureaucracy? Why would I want to manage large supply chains? To manufacture medication or generally leverage comparative advantage to produce surplus to lower total required labor hours. That sounds boring and exploitative and like something I'd have more fun blowing up. This is literally how all specialization works. How would you produce medicine? By making it. Oh man, this is the greatest example of how anarchism, in large part, as it's practiced by white Westerners, is a pure, like, just made up, vibey identity category and not an actual political ideology in any way, shape, or form. Amazing.
Let's continue.
I'm sure there are real anarchists in the world somewhere, but I haven't encountered them in any English-speaking space. That's all.
Pinko means no. Pinko is not a brand. Pinko is a offhanded term for basically a fake communist. It's like a hippie communist, aka Pinko.
No, Pinko was not. Pinko was literally a term used by the U.S. state against communists in propaganda and shit. Just means a communist. Doesn't mean fake.
A Pinko commie was a term that was used
for basically liberal. I'm like 90% sure that it was used just like a general slur against communists, but I haven't actually looked it up. Yeah, Pinko is a pejorative term coined in 1925 in the United States to describe a person regarded as being sympathetic to communism. So not like a fake communist or anything, just a general communist slur.
Old communist LARPers back in the day. It hasn't been popular for a long time.
It's very much unite, but on our terms. Hence why many socialist people of color prefer the company of other people like them, even if their views don't exactly line up, than with white socialists. And it only really takes a quick look at Ian's repertoire to see why that might be.
So I'm going to go a little bit hard on her. I don't give a fuck if you don't like being around white people.
He's got this incredibly juvenile...
I don't get that. I don't get... There's not enough context for me to understand what's going on there.
Gamer bro.
I mean, you don't really need context there. Like, you could respond to that, like, with some sort of... That sort of thing, like, with some sort of analysis, even if you don't agree with what they're saying, of where they're coming from. Like, you can look at these things with actual fucking care. Any sort of nuance that shows that you give an actual shit about black people, you can just be like, I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck about what you think about white people. Like, when I see, like, Kanye West being anti-Semitic and shit, what I think of that isn't particularly, oh man, this guy's just like the fucking Nazis. He's the exact same. It's like, well, for one, where does this group, the Black Hebrew Israelites that he hates so much, come from? It takes like 2 seconds to find out. You look into their beliefs, and it's like they believe every single white person who ever existed, white historical figure ever existed, was actually black, and them sort of like appropriating Jewish identity for themselves is just sort of another part of that. So where groups like that come from is literally the system of white supremacy. It's literally all the same shit. It's like, you know, it's the economy stupid. It's white supremacy stupid. Groups like that exist. Now, obviously, it's not an excuse for fucking Kanye West, who's incredibly rich and has, you know, he could pay people to do research for him on whatever he wants. He has no excuse. But generally, groups like this exist because the version of black history that is peddled everywhere and taught to people removes black agency entirely. The fact that black people fought for their own liberation in every step of the way. It's like the way that black history is taught in the US is black people were passive victims who did nothing, and then MLK came along. That's how you get things like Afrocentrism, which Black Hebrew Israelitism is just an offshoot of. That's how you get those shit. That's why people gravitate towards it. So ironically, the way that you fight these things isn't by just being like, haha, these people are literally black Nazis, they're the exact same. It's by analyzing where these currents come from and fighting the root of them, which is, it's all white supremacy. So what BadMouse is pointing out here, which she is too stupid to realize, is that Vaush engages with black people and black issues, even black people who are very clearly wrong, like obviously the Black Hebrew Israelites are wrong, you know, in a way that is just totally dismissive and really just racist. He doesn't want to understand where it comes from. He's emotionally invested in trying to frame like black people behaving badly in these sorts of ways that stem from white supremacy as merely equal to the white supremacists. Like they are like black Nazis, right? They're not different to them. They're not coming from a totally different place. They're not essentially just another symptom of the same system of white supremacy that we need to dismantle in order to fight all of these things at once. Rather, they are an example of how black people can be racist just as bad as white people. And that is the fucking issue here. Another good example of that is you are taught in many US schools. It might have changed now. I've been told this by many different black people. I've actually had people send me emails to talk about this before. That Rosa Parks sat down on that bus in the whites only area because she was just tired. She was just tired after a long day at work. When it was a part of a well-planned act of civil disobedience. So agency is removed from black struggle to paint it as like just a series of injustices that was levied against them by white people, which white people then graciously decided to relieve them from, rather than white people being forced to change these things because of black struggle against them. So all of the really positive parts of black history in the United States of America and also in other places is stripped from them to tell these narratives of black people being graciously freed from their bondage by good, nice white people. And that is really the root of a lot of the so-called black racism that these people have been rallying against recently, particularly with the Black Hebrew Israelites. I don't expect Demon Mama to think about this on that level because she's not smart enough to, but that is where Vaush comes from here, where he's just immediately dismissing and yelling at any black person who he comes across.
Populist understanding of race.
Throughout history, there has been one thing the capitalist class has feared: workers of different races organizing separately without solidarity. Read history, lib. That's why strikebreakers and business owners have historically encouraged labor unions to racially integrate, because it makes them weaker. What is this?
The thing with this tweet is it's largely untrue. Unions in settler colonial countries, especially the US, Canada, Australia, etc., have been historically incredibly racially segregated. They didn't want black people among them. Unions were essentially a core part of white supremacy, just like the white racial class struggle that excluded most other people. You know, it was unions in Australia, for example, who organized campaigns against Chinese immigration. It wasn't the capitalists. I don't know if that's why BadMouse put it here, but it certainly merits being here because it's just factually, historically incorrect.
What is wrong with this statement? I think it's a little sarcastic, but what is wrong with this? This is like literally a thing that actually happened.
For one, largely, no, it didn't. Framing this as something that was like a historical truth that you know, generally represents the history of the matter is not true. For two, it's totally valid to put this here because it's another great example of how Vaush just completely offhandedly discounts black people talking about their own issues and how white people just kind of push these really unhelpful narratives, like demands for how they should act upon them. Because if you don't understand how and why black people might want to organize separately from white people after enduring, because it's still ongoing, everything that has been imposed upon them, not just in the US, but in many other places around the world too, you're just being intentionally obtuse. And this goes back to everything I just talked about with the black Hebrew Israelites. You can apply that to everything else. You can try to understand where they come from, even when you disagree, rather than just offhandedly dismissing them with these smug, sarcastic, know-it-all sort of tweets.
Like businesses in the past, bosses in the past would intentionally would intentionally make racial tensions in the workplace worse.
Bosses in the past and today also have always largely been in favor, for example, of migration because in the past they could pay Chinese workers less, for example. Now that doesn't mean that the unions who oppose them because I hate Chinese people were correct, but it's a complete exaggeration of what capitalist interests, or what was in their interest. It's a complete mischaracterization of history. Bosses wanted Chinese people to come in to work on the railroads because they could pay them less. Now, the problem with that narrative on the side of the white unions was this narrative that them doing so somehow disadvantages them, which they also then integrated with a bunch of other racism to sort of justify that. Like these very general statements about history that are very unrepresentative of large and hugely important parts of it kind of do a disservice to the overall narrative here. But either way, it's a big aside, because even if what Vosh was saying here was factually correct, it would still be incorrect. It would still be dumb for him to say this, because he's just avoiding thinking about the issue in anything resembling remotely complicated terms. Like, why might my historical victims, yes, your historical victims, because you are a white person living under white supremacy, why might my historical victims feel this way about people like me? That is the question that you should be asking yourself, not just dismissing them and getting fucking offended and being like, haha, black Nazi racist. That's the crux of the issue here.
We caught Amazon doing it earlier in the year. Yeah, Amazon literally did this earlier in the year. It might have been back in April. Maybe that was what the response to this was. But Amazon was literally using racial tensions to break up union action in their factories.
Amongst many other things, that appears to give off a progressive tone, but in reality it just feels mute and hollow, not to mention egoistic. It's not a reactionary perspective to want to not talk to white leftists. It's you being arrogant and starting with the position that I am right, everybody come
thank
to
you for
me.
the gifted sub. Thank you very much.
They're not coming to me. Well, then in that case, they must be reactionary. But of course, it's not.
I don't feel like this is a particularly accurate analysis of what's going on here.
It literally is. It's a white guy who is incredibly fucking pissed that actually, really, most people of color who have ever seen him and know who he is don't care about what he has to say. Dismiss what he has to say. That's what it's all about.
I do think there's room to
you go to Vosh's YouTube metrics. I'm not sure if it shows ethnicity in YouTube metrics, but I guarantee if it was there, you would get 99% white, 100%.
To criticize what Vosh said. I just did it 2 seconds ago. I just don't think this is a fair framing.
Just Ian,
or
it's
fair
systemic.
summarization.
And I think part of this comes down to the way we're often taught about topics like nationalism in school and the media, by just simply showing the white boogeyman and not understanding it as a very serious thing that has a lot of complexities and duality to it. If you watch Flower's video, she explains there that there were once various people groups across the contiguous United States who are now just known under the simple moniker of Native American or American Indian. That's because of history. History, power dynamics, and minoritization. These forces created a shared struggle amongst those people, a shared experience, if you will, that coalesced these groups as a nation. Importantly,
This is not accurate, though. This is not accurate.
Yes, it is.
This is not accurate. There is
Just say it 5 times and it might be true, I guess.
not one single nation. Hold on a second. We can prove this wrong with a fucking Wikipedia search.
Do you understand that there can be a nation with multiple constituent parts? Or is that not a thing that you can understand? Because Indigenous people were factually united in their struggle by what has been collectively imposed upon them by the United States of America. That's why you get, you want a simple Google search. Wow. What is this? What happened in the US and in Canada? You get shit like, for example, the what was it called? Like the ochre crisis in Canada in the late 80s, early 90s. Native Americans from the US literally crossed the border to Canada with guns to go and fight the Canadian state alongside other groups of Indigenous people. Because what has happened as a result of colonialism in the US is the sort of coalescing of Indigenous nations into one united sort of interest group. It doesn't mean that this wider group, represented by organizations like the American Indian Movement and others, doesn't still have individual nations within it. But the fact of the matter is that labels like Native American, American Indian, etc., they exist today, not simply because they were imposed upon these people, but also because these people have been united with a very common struggle against their colonizers, against people like her. So it's like, I can debunk this with a simple Google search. Yeah, there are different nations of indigenous people. And there's also the much wider nation, so to speak, of American Indian, indigenous. Hell, there's even indigenous solidarity cross borders, things like that. People have been united, particularly in the United States, for example, where they are all fighting against the exact same enemy. So they've been united against them over the course of many centuries, to the point where people within these groups often identify as a part of a much wider movement alongside their own national identities. The thing that she's taking exception to here, it's kind of like saying, no, you can't say they're all Soviet, because they're also Ukrainian and Russian and whatever. It's totally nonsensical. Let's see her debunk this.
Look at this. Look at this. I can do this quick. Look, tribal nations. This is from
Wow.
literally National Congress of American Indians. There is tribal nations.
Why is it the National Congress of American Indians in the first place if they are not in some way largely united in their struggle against the USA due to what has happened to them as a result of colonialism? Why does this National Congress of American Indians even exist in the first fucking place if what BadMouse is saying isn't true? My God, man. Someone learning about the very basics of settler colonialism in their own country for the first time in their entire fucking life. And it's just like, I'm going to debunk this by Googling. I'm going to debunk this by Googling and clicking on the first thing I see. Think for a fucking second. Jesus, man.
States, there's how many of them are there? Let's look at their little thing. Hold on. Let's look. This is their... What are you talking about? There is no single national movement right now. That is not even accurate.
There is no single national movement right now. That is not even accurate. That is not even accurate. As I look at the website for the Congress of American Indians, there is no single national movement. You are on a website called the National Congress of American Indians. There is no single movement. As I look at the website for a massive movement uniting many different nations of indigenous people in one struggle. I don't think I can handle this for much longer, and I shouldn't subject you guys to this for much longer either. So we'll give it like 5 more minutes.
Can we get information from this group alone? Like, native peoples are the essence of our nations, not one nation. Land, our connection to place is both physical and spiritual, and it helps define who we are as people. Culture, traditions, new and old, sustain our societies. Language, family,
It's like reading things and hoping that she comes across something that she thinks agrees with her, I guess.
And art, ceremonies, life ways of living. Governance, social organizing, and political structures vary from tribal nation to tribal nation based on unique histories, cultures, and worldviews. This is ahistorical right here.
How is it ahistorical when the very existence of this organization proves his point, which is that due to colonialism, due to having very similar struggles against the United States of America, Canada, or what have you, previously disunited groups of indigenous people have united with one another to fight for very common goals in a very common struggle. That's precisely what he was saying, and precisely what the group that you are using as proof of him being wrong exists because of. Like, Jesus Christ, man.
This is what he's saying here is false, is definitively false, and also is just it literally ignores the perspective of the very people
she does this she's just like, you're literally ignoring the perspective of this group of people who I claim to speak for. You're literally ignoring the minority perspective of these people. This is weaponized social justice rhetoric. Social justice, great concept, used by the dumbest people in the worst ways. It's just a white person weaponizing this notion that, like, you are literally disrespecting X group of people. You are literally disrespecting X group of people to ironically attack someone who is not only correct, but explaining the very basics of settler colonialism to them. Based on what? Like a bad turn of phrase because he said nations, because he used the word nation.
Communism is based.
Unbelievable. It's very similar to the way that Israel weaponizes social justice rhetoric. So it's someone ironically using the notion of this incredibly false notion of someone else marginalizing indigenous identities and indigenous nations or whatever to justify the continued settler colonial subjugation of those indigenous people.
He's claiming to argue on defense of. There is not a single national movement. There is.
All that she's been doing is going off on these completely unrelated tangents without actually being able to refute a single word of what's being said. It's incredible. This is streamer for you.
Many of them don't believe in a single national movement. That's so frustrating. This is a big problem right here.
still exist. They still exist there.
Hell, there's literally tribal politics undermining each other in this state. Muckleshoot has claimed itself to be the true inheritor of the Duwamish tribe, so they're using political power to keep the existing Duwamish.
The funniest thing about streamers is how they read that chat and desperately look for someone to tell them something they can just repeat verbatim and be like, yeah, that's true. Wow, I own this guy. I didn't even read my chat. You guys have nothing. You guys have absolutely fucking nothing to offer me. Fuck you.
Duwamish tribe from getting recognition. Of course. Again, this is making everybody into a monolith. And also, it ignores the fact that
in terms of their struggle against colonialism against the United States of America, they really are a monolith because all of them have been wronged in the end in the completely same, the same exact ways, pretty much. Initially, there were certain groups who allied with the US, certain groups who didn't, but they all ended up getting fucked over in the same ways in the end, which united them in a very common struggle for Indigenous liberation. And that's precisely what BadMouse is talking about here, you dumb motherfucker. As you desperately read your chat to for some way to make a irrelevant social justice argument about how he's totally disrespecting the Indigenous people I'm the true advocate for. Shut the fuck up.
there are different struggles between each of these groups. Not that there isn't solidarity to be found between them, but the idea that they've unified into a single national movement is not true. That is definitive.
Like, she's splitting hairs here. There's never a single national movement ever, anywhere, ever, obviously. But the very existence of this, the first thing that she clicked on Google here, is proof of the fact that they very much have coalesced into having very, very similar interests in their very, very similar fights against colonialism, and very much act as a block in doing so.
Definitively not true.
And most importantly, there's somebody else there who isn't part of that group for a plethora of reasons. Ask yourself the reason why we call people who live in Britain British, rather than, say, Brittonic. It's because the
What?
What?
Oh God, UK people need to stop talking about American politics, for fuck's.
What? American politics? She's characterizing Indigenous struggles against colonialism as American politics? Now, my friend, the Indigenous struggle against colonialism exists precisely in opposition to the existence of the United States of America. We're not talking about American politics here. We're talking about opposition to the very existence of the country that you live in. The settler colonial country that you live in. Oh my God, British people need to stop talking about this. Makes me so uncomfortable. Let me try and find the first fucking thing that I can find to complain about.
Sake. This makes no sense. I'm about to, I don't know. Let's
Why the hell does it make no fucking sense? It makes perfect sense. You're incredibly stupid. This is like a really dumb person having like a brain overload.
No, let's fucking do it.
Brittonic tribes physically don't exist as a concept anymore. They've been absorbed into the dustbin of history through conquest, miscegenation, and the lack of a dominant power to contrast with. It doesn't justify any such horrific acts of history, but it's simply a fact.
What? Is this an ant? Wait, okay, hold on a second. I don't know how to feel
I don't want to hold on a second. Can you just play the fucking video?
about this.
And they can't really be reconciled. You attempt to try and revive an ancient culture as your identity. You can try, even if you trace your ancestry back.
I love this. It's like a fat Brexit guy being like, "Oi, bro, I'm indigenous."
Over 2,000 years.
I don't think this argument is this is not what he wants to say.
You don't even know what he's saying.
Holy shit, this is not what he wants to say. Just hold on, let me show you something.
What he's saying here is that indigenous people don't exist in the UK because they have since coalesced into the UK has essentially coalesced a bunch of different ethnicities into one relatively unified ethnicity, national group with very similar national interests.
Real quick. Hold on.
And that's why we don't call people from the UK indigenous, but we do call people from America indigenous, because in one of these cases, there is an ongoing anti-colonial struggle. In the other, there is not, nor has there ever really meaningfully been. A lot of people misconstrue ethnogenesis as being some form of colonialism when it's not.
Okay? So the parallel that he's drawing between these people, who we're supposed to laugh at, right? Because he's saying these are the goofy people trying to reclaim their stuff. He drew these people in parallel to Native Americans.
He did not. I've watched this before. He's specifically, if I remember correctly, he's specifically explaining the difference between, like, what happened in Britain versus what happened in the Americas. Settler colonialism versus just like centuries upon centuries of history of different conquests, essentially of elite replacement rather than actual colonialism.
This is a terrible argument.
Ethnogenesis is basically like, the process throughout history where different national groups or ethnicities have like slowly merged into other ethnicities to the point where the original ones don't exist anymore. It's like, biblical Canaanites or whatever don't exist anymore, for example, because over lots of time, through lots of different events, they coalesced into other groups of people.
It can't be his intention. It can't be his intention. But like,
play the video, please. And what a lot of people do is they take ethnogenesis, which is why I was mentioning it. They take ethnogenesis, right? And they're like, for example, the ancient Celts don't exist anymore. That's because of settler colonialism. When the ancient Celts were not wiped out, they did not have their culture intentionally destroyed. They just essentially, over the course of time, cultures changed, societies changed, to the point where there was no more identifiable culture. And that's basically what it means.
It's a terrible argument to make. He's placing these people that he's
I wouldn't even say they were assimilated. They were not assimilated. They just, over time, ceased to sort of exist because ethnicity, culture, are not physically existing things. They're social constructs of human beings. And over time, human culture changes. Human society changes. And that's pretty much what happened. Particularly in Britain. Britain is a really good example because it's an example of a place where there were tons of, lots of different invasions, changes of rulers, conquests, etc. But very few of them could probably be called colonialism. Only really the Roman rule of Britain could probably be called colonialism. Most, like for example, the Norman conquest. The Normans conquered Britain. They brought over like only 20,000 or so settlers. They installed themselves in the elite. And within like one or two generations, they were functionally identical to the people who were there before them. They were essentially subsumed by the pre-existing culture. They ironically were assimilated into the group of people who they conquered. So you obviously can't call that colonialism. That is rather elite replacement that didn't really have any sort of assimilationist or eliminationist aspect of the people who were there before them. So it's not colonialism. It's not the same thing.
It doesn't work because there isn't an equivalent dynamic involved. So you end up looking like a weirdo and not the oppressed. Self-appointed druids are not under attack in this country. That's what it's all about. Who's being affected now?
Exactly. That's what he was fucking explaining. She just assumed that he was making a totally different fucking argument.
Not some stupid red ice media level discussion on who owned it last. So when these groups form as a nation, their inherent experience, in contrast to the other, takes on a fundamentally different character.
You can see what he means here because he's explicitly comparing things like Pan-Africanism and stuff like that to the indigenous groups of the US and Canada.
This is very odd so far.
No, it's not. You're just fucking dumb. Not everything that you don't understand is odd. Sometimes you're just fucking stupid.
This to be a very, I find this to be a very poor critique so far.
I want to talk about poor critiques. What the fuck is this?
Let me ask you another question.
Communism
Name
is based...
me a white nationalism, or an English nationalism, or a French, Aussie, German, American nationalism that fundamentally cements its beliefs as left-leaning. You can't. That's because the inherent nature of majority powerful nations leans itself towards vulgar characteristics. Like spoiled toddlers getting their toys taken away, they lash out at the slightest glimpse of fairness. You go to a country...
That's not even an argument. I don't even...
How is she this dumb? How does she not see that he is comparing, for example, black indigenous nationalisms to reactionary nationalisms whose primary goal is the maintenance of power versus oppressed people's nationalisms whose primary goal is their liberation? You don't get it? It's so fucking obvious. Saying that you don't get it, this is a bad argument. It's an attack on yourself. It's not an attack on the person who you're responding to.
Know how to respond to that.
How has anyone watched this? It's someone basically just revealing themselves as an idiot constantly.
A country like Ireland, however, a former colony, and notice how the nature of Irish nationalism, or republicanism, historically carried with it a very different standing to that of its neighbour. Go even further down the rung, there are even more pressing issues that need solving, and thus the nature of these groups fold themselves towards solving those present injustices. Whether a group actually calls itself a nationalism or not, it doesn't take away the very material reality that emerges when one is of a shared culture, history, or language.
I mean, that's actually a very good way of explaining why some nationalisms are far better than others. It's just material interests, really, because when you have, when a national group is on the top, on the, like US nationalism, for example, that nationalism is naturally going to gravitate towards supporting the material interests of that country, which in this case is continued genocidal imperialism. Whereas when you have a nationalism of an oppressed group like Palestinians, obviously the biggest issue facing them is their national oppression and the need to solve that. Hence, they're just going to naturally sort of materially gravitate towards solving that issue above anything else. So it's a very good explanation of how some nationalisms are different to others and how we need to treat them differently rather than just be like, black Nazis, ha ha ha. But she somehow doesn't get it.
American, you can watch all manner of American media and get that funny feeling inside. That same feeling cannot always be said for others.
That funny feeling isn't a good thing. That nationalistic fervor is a bad thing.
Is nationalistic fervor for a Palestinian the same as nationalistic fervor for an American? No, it's not. How do you not understand what he's explicitly and obviously saying? This is painful.
Knowledge that these nationalistic structures are not a good thing. What the fuck is he? What the fuck?
This is what happens when you're very stupid but think you're very smart. You just say what the fuck at everything without being able to explain yourself, without being able to understand the very basics of what it is being said. This is just painful. I'll give it like one more minute.
Fuck. This is an incoherent video. I just don't get it. I don't understand what's being set up here.
It's not even being set up. It's been outright said.
That funny feeling is cringe. Yeah. What? Okay. I want to try and make sense of this, but so far this is a very weak argument. I did not think this was the angle that was going to be approached. I bet the comments.
Honestly,
I thought the angle was going to be much more along the lines of what John the Duncan did. So having watched this so far, I think John the Duncan's video is stronger, even though I do still feel like that John the Duncan missed the mark on that video. But most people here probably haven't seen that one yet. So. Scottish Green Party, Scottish Socialist Party, and Northern Independence Party. Parties that are on the left and would be classified as nationals in the UK. Yeah, I recognize that. I recognize there are leftist nationalist movements, but I don't understand what he's trying to say here. This is just. I don't know. There was no.
I got it literally immediately. I don't. Oh my god.
Point made there. It was just that, like, why are there no left-wing nationalist movements? But that he had previously just mentioned left-wing nationalist movements.
He's specifically explaining why there are left-wing nationalist movements because their interests are fundamentally different to those of reactionary nationalist movements due to the status that their countries haven't defined themselves in. It's so
I don't know what he's talking about.
Jesus Christ.
Out here.
There's a great shock to discover.
Notice how I respond to what she's saying. She's just like, I don't get it. He's so dumb. I don't get it.
That when Gary Cooper was killing off the Indians and you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. You live in a country in which the dominant hegemony represents and glorifies people like you. And whether you disagree with that hegemony or not, just saying that doesn't matter. You're still influenced by it. That's why the calls of people to say, oh, it's nothing doesn't really matter because you still have a home to go back to.
Nobody no one in this conversation has ever said, oh, it's nothing. I think that's very bad faith.
It's funny because what she and Vosh argue for is essentially, oh, it's nothing. It's happened, get over it.
Still have a nation by which you can rest on. In summary, status quo nationalism almost always bends to the right. But in oppressed ones, you get a mix. We'll say, though, that even a vulgar trend from an oppressed nationalism is not and never the same as its polar opposite. Take a very known example. The Nation of Islam is, of course, well known for its highly homophobic, sexist, and...
She's not going to like someone going into an actual, considered explanation of why the Nation of Islam came to be, why it still exists. Rather, she's going to be like, oh my god, I can't believe he's apologizing for Louis Farrakhan.
Frankly, weird views. I bet even Ian might label them as racist towards whites. But in their position as an...
That smuckle was embarrassing.
I would never call anyone embarrassing if I were you.
Group, they are still in the mission of helping black self-determination, be that in prisons, drug rehab, and housing and employment projects. Those are all things that speak to the people they're talking to, and just as a matter of fact...
Wait, but...
They often do it a lot better than many communist groups in the United States. So, yeah, think about that.
It is true. The Nation of Islam, and Farrakhan specifically, not so much anymore. I don't think he really does much anymore. He's pretty old. In like the 80s, he actually did do a lot of community organizing, and that's what brought a lot of people into the Nation of Islam. Not so much into the Nation of Islam as much as into like, idolizing Farrakhan.
That is a very easy...
He did shit. And that's not to say that he's good or anything, or he has good views, because his views are fucking terrible. But people like him and the groups that they are a part of, that they're leaders of, fundamentally have very different origins to, for example, white supremacist groups. They are fundamentally formed from sort of different reactionary leaning explanations for oppression that all come down to white supremacy in the end.
way of understanding why there is a difference between black and white nationalism, and how the common reduction of it into a vile mass of in-group and out-group dynamics just doesn't hold up.
But I don't think that was that doesn't track. That doesn't follow.
Why not?
The idea that Nation of Islam is really anti-Semitic, but sometimes advocates for good things, does not actually say anything about nationalist movements. That's just...
I do think that BadMouse gave his audience too much credit with this video, and he should have been far more explicit with his explanations, because people like this just do not understand it.
There's no conclusion there. There's been a step missed.
Yeah, there's no conclusion because it's a part of a broader argument. You don't just make your conclusion in the middle of like 25% into the video.
Because there are very genuine claims made by one group that simply doesn't compare to the other. It's not all relative like some seem to think it is. Such claims are decidedly liberal.
Wait, hold on. No, they're not. Gay people in Saudi Arabia are just a product of Western degeneracy that feeds in through global media.
This was really funny how like Warsh tried to say that like gay people in Saudi Arabia are the same thing as like white people colonizing, for example, Native American land. And this was incredibly fucking funny because could you please tell me when gay people have ever done settler colonialism in Saudi Arabia? Is there a gay supremacist settler colonial regime in Saudi Arabia? I don't think that's ever happened. What the fuck are you talking about, you stupid motherfucker? So like inventing a scenario that literally hasn't exists and comparing it to something that it has absolutely nothing to do with, and apparently his audience goes crazy for it.
Reality, it's actually a product of white international culture.
Well, yeah, a gay settler colonial conquest of Saudi Arabia would be very good. That is true. Unfortunately, though, the USA would prevent it from happening because the new gay nation would probably sanction the USA and not give them oil because of the USA constantly mass murdering gay and trans people.
Cultural bias that is infesting the people in Saudi Arabia. So given they're basically a symptom of Western degeneracy, do you think they not have a right to address that in whatever way they think is most culturally effective?
The great thing about reality is that you can wheedle out the difference between truths and untruths.
At the historical record and determine who's colonized.
Okay, BadMouse here has no right whatsoever to claim anything about the truth versus non-truth, seeing as how he alleged that the Native American movement in the United States is a purely nationalistic movement that is
so dumb.
United behind a single nation, when that is definitively not true. And anybody who's...
I want to die. You can't just go back to a point where you made a point that wasn't actually a point.
Ever engaged with Indigenous politics would know that that's the case. This is just...
You've never engaged with Indigenous politics if you did not understand easily specifically what he was saying there, especially given the comparisons that he made afterwards.
He's just wrong about a lot of things so far. He's just been wrong about the facts. Why have we fucking brought it up on here? That even the more liberal organizations recognize that there are multiple independent nations that all have different views on these...
Holy shit, how is she harping on something that she was just wrong about for so long?
And dogmatic. But like I said, we live in a world made up of nations. And until that physically goes away, anything else is, again, just vague gesturing.
No. Oh, we get to call out some fucking statist propaganda right here.
This is lifestyle anarchism par excellence. We live in a world made up of states. Factually true. Statist propaganda. We don't live in a world made up of states. National liberation doesn't matter. Oh, if she does the thing where she's like, no Palestine or Israel. Abolish Palestine and Israel. Fuck Palestinian nationalism and Israeli nationalism. That's like the anarchist take on Israel-Palestine that completely fucking ignores that when you are oppressed on a national basis, that national oppression needs to be fucking dealt with above all else.
That right there is statist propaganda. That is...
If I say statist propaganda
is simply not true. See, I strongly disagree with this position.
I don't care if you strongly disagree with it. It's factually true.
We live in a world of nations and states, but that does not mean that we have to engage in a conflict of nation-state.
She's like fucking vibrating here. I want to die.
A direct nation-state conflict. In fact, I think that perpetuates the problem. The answer to nation-states is...
You know what perpetuates the Palestinian struggle against Israeli colonialism? It's not Israeli colonialism. It's that Palestinians fight back. It's that Palestinians even have a national identification and national aspirations in the first place. Statist propaganda. I cannot fucking believe.
Refusing to engage in the nation-state. in my opinion. Most places. I think there are rooms. I think there's
Look at you refusing to engage in the nation state right now. You're doing a really good job of it, aren't you?
grounds to say that some nationalistic-based struggles have had successes. I just don't think it's the great answer. Was this the dude?
Okay. What's your alternative? Where's your successful anarchist movement? They don't fucking exist. They literally don't exist. Some national-based movements have had success. Very true. Not just some. Many. Countless dozens. Now, let's compare them with the alternative. The anti-state, the anti-national liberation movement position that she seems to be espousing here. List of successes. 0. 0. Ever. None. Absolutely fucking none. Now, of course, anarchists like to say that Rojava, for example, is anarchist. It's not. It's literally the most generic example of state capitalism you could ever imagine. They like to say that the Zapatistas, the EZLN, are anarchists. They explicitly say that they aren't anarchists and that they are an organization with people of many different ideologies who simply essentially take on the role of a municipal government with very much status level of organization. They have their own little police force. They have their own municipality organized medical centers. They organize essentially in the same way that a generic status municipality government does. So all of the examples that they try to claim in successes are not anarchists. And the examples that they discount have achieved so much more than any anarchist movement ever has. And I don't think this particularly has much to say about anarchism as a whole. I think it says a lot, though, about the insecurities that anarchists feel, because they don't actually have any practical examples for the things that they prescribe. They don't have any practical example of, say, anything that she's saying here actually happening. Like, why should we give you the time of day when your critique of this sort of advocacy for national liberation can provide 0 examples of an alternative?
Feels like he supports the
Holocaust. National liberation perspective of, when you as a nation, as a group, are oppressed on that basis, fighting that must take precedent over anything else before we can even think of, any moving forward to anything better. That sort of thinking has led to so much more just improvement and good in the world, what someone like this would probably call harm reduction and frame as good, than anything resembling anarchism has ever even remotely came close to achieving. So from the get-go, we're not really exactly dealing with equal concepts here.
Chat that likened Pro Flowers versus Vosh to Malcolm versus MLK. I don't know if it was. But this is a you can see this person's bias leaking in. The idea that the world is a world of nations and states and that we must engage on the terms of nations.
The world is a nation of nations and states. Yes.
States is.
It's so weird because I'm 100% sure that she uses the phrase harm reduction. Let me check. So it's like harm reduction, right? For her, we need to reduce harm using the presently existing frameworks of nation and states. But also, we should not do that. Okay, easy to find. Here's Demon Mama talking about harm reduction, using status frameworks for harm reduction. Apparently acknowledging that exact same sort of argument in the case of national liberation movements is somehow wrong, and we should pay credence to completely unproven lifestyle anarchist ideas of how the world should be instead, and just ignore the incredibly pressing issues of national liberation that can either choose to, that those fighting for that liberation can either choose to solve them in ways that have been proven to function in practice, or just adopt your idealistic notion of how things should be. Doesn't work very well. I don't know why I haven't stopped.
That is not. You have to actually evidence.
I want to see what BadMouse has to say.
So in a situation such as Israel-Palestine, we can now better understand the dynamics involved in the stakes they play. Palestinians, which, remember, doesn't exclude Indigenous Jews and other MENA minorities, are, as of current, the Indigenous group of today. Not because they lived there for a while, but because of a shared experience through contrast to a dominant group. Just like the Maori are Indigenous to New Zealand, even though they only arrived some 300 years before the Europeans did. Jewish people, of course, still have the right to self-determination. They still exist today as a minoritized group. What that does not suddenly grant them, however, is rule over a land because their people happened to live there some time ago.
Wait. He shot himself in the foot with this example here.
How?
He shot himself in the foot. His framework doesn't work to analyze Israel-Palestine.
Yes, it does. It literally just did. He just applied it to it. That was the most basic fucking Israel-Palestine explanation of settler colonialism you could ever imagine. How?
He's just demonstrated that the nation-state example doesn't do a good job of.
He's using 2 examples of national groups, who are in conflict with one another.
There's no room. They can't
One
come
is
there.
a dominant settler colonial group that came recently claiming predominance over the land on an ethnic basis, an ethno-nationalist basis, and the other is a group of people who coalesced into a national liberation movement in opposition to that dominance that has been imposed upon them. Perfectly great example of how the framework of national liberation is easily applicable in this case and in many other cases. How not? How is it not applicable?
Explaining the situation in Israel-Palestine, that you can that a otherwise marginalized group can be put in charge of a nation state that then goes on to commit genocide. Yeah, this is
what?
This is
Why
this is
not?
an incoherent video.
It's not incoherent. You've done nothing. What you just said is nonsensical.
Genuinely mean that. So far, this is an incoherent video.
Okay, we're done with this projection. I just want to see what BadMouse said about this, because I've watched this video before, but I've forgotten.
It wasn't an apartheid-esque situation until the lines were drawn by the settlers. And arguably...
What do you think? Who do you think draws the lines everywhere? Who do you think draws the lines? Nation states. Nation states draw arbitrary lines.
This is the fucking idiotic anarchist argument par excellence. The national liberation struggle in Palestine doesn't matter because nation states all bad. Nation states all bad. Ergo, Palestinians shouldn't fight against Israeli colonialism on a national basis. I fucking hate anarchists. I fucking hate them. But luckily they have no power. They never will. They have no influence. They never will. Yeah, that wasn't very fun. I'm done. This person has nothing interesting or insightful to offer. There's no reason to give them any consideration aside from to laugh at them, which is what I was here for. And we did it. Good job, everyone.